Welcome to Common Sense. I'm Ed.
And I'm John. How you doing, Ed?
I'm good, John. Did you have a good Thanksgiving?
Yeah, it was good. The usual. I'm not a
But
not a big turkey fan, so I did fine.
I just love that 4-day break. There's something so special about that 4 days where almost nobody works during that time, and it's really different than any other holiday that bounces around different days of the week and stuff. So I always enjoy that.
It is the most laid back holiday I think of all. It's not quite Christmas, and it's not like everybody's running out to go on vacation somewhere. So I like that. It's
Right?
pretty cool.
Cool.
All right. Well, I thought we'd do something a little different today. So we normally talk about either really high level topics like gender equality in sales and marketing, or really tactical topics like the role of BDRs in sales. But today I thought we'd try something right in the middle. So we're going to talk about the evolving role of the board of directors for today's B2B industrial companies, something I know you know a lot about, and I've had a little bit of experience with it too. When I think about my years of experience, I've worked for enterprises, sort of mid-size independents, and also a small marketing agency. So I've had different experience with boards from different points of view. In fact, I was on the board of a public energy company. And as I recall, our meetings were, mostly the board meeting, BORED.
That must have been pre-Starbucks.
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot going on, and mostly it was all about sort of rubber stamping the CEO's recommendations. But I know you have some ideas and some experience about boards evolving since a few years ago, and not so much that people are just deferential to the CEO anymore. So why don't you start us off on your thoughts on that?
I think it's a really fascinating topic, and I'm thrilled that we're talking about it. I am kind of lucky enough to watch it a little bit from the inside. I'm a board governance fellow with the National Association of Corporate Directors, and the NACD as an organization kind of establishes best practices on board operation for public and private as well as nonprofit boards. And so there's a lot of, they say thought leadership. That's such a overused term, but they really do think a lot about this stuff and publish a lot on it. So it's interesting to watch and to be part of it. If we talk about what's changing, I'd say there's really two things. First of all, business is moving so much faster and it's so much more competitive world. And so if the board's role is really to be the CEO's boss, then that role as the CEO's boss requires more active engagement because the CEO faces a more complicated environment that they need to operate. Second, I think the litigious nature of society is changing what the board does. I mean, companies are exposed to a wide range of threats, some legitimate, some contrived, in many cases, grievous challenges to their financial stability. And often the board members can find themselves with personal exposure in more ways than they did in the past. And so issues like cybersecurity, compliance, sexual harassment, and even general liability can consume huge amounts of energy for the board as well as money. And so that means because boards are facing this, they're getting, in many cases, more actively involved in the business. The old adage, for a board was nose in, fingers out. And the premise was that you wanted to make sure you were aware and asking the questions and ensuring the CEO was engaged, but you weren't micromanaging. You were letting him or her, the CEO, run the business. And I think that's changing a bit. The boards used to be comprised of current or former CEOs from other companies, but now it's common for the Nom/Gov committee to build a matrix of required skills for a board and deliberately recruit members with certain skill sets. And you've certainly heard there was recently a bill in California about gender diversity on boards, and gender diversity is a big topic as well as age diversity. There's a lot of retired CEOs, white guys that sit on boards, and there's a question about performance of companies that have broader board participation. But boards are also looking for specific experience. They need people that aren't just kind of casually aware of cybersecurity, but really understand it at a high level sort of way, and international business. and certain business situations, like companies that are thinking about bolting on a franchise model would want to find somebody for the board that has experience in doing that kind of thing. And of course, digital transformation, which kind of comes to the heart of a lot of what we talk about. And these are new requirements in many cases. Boards have often plenty of supply chain and manufacturing and finance expertise on the board, but these kinds of skills are often not represented. And I think that those things are all happening in parallel with the elevation of the role of the CMO. Now you're calling it a CMO as opposed to a VP of marketing. Harvard Business Review's article about, probably a year ago on the role of strategic CMOs, I think illustrates that, and the CFO's role in taking responsibility for marketing, because it's now so empirical in many cases, all kind of speak to that trend. So, the board still doesn't manage the CEO, but they know what the CEO and senior management team need to be working on. And I think in general, they're holding them more accountable.
That's really interesting. The other one I thought of when you were mentioning the other chiefs is the chief revenue officer. That's kind of a new one too. Someone specifically tasked with looking after revenue because the CEO has other things on his plate or her plate.
Right.
So,
right.
So I guess what we're saying is, for B2B industrial companies, the board's role is now much more than just reviewing financials. And what about the CEO? Are they happy with this arrangement?
Well, every CEO is an individual just like each of us, and probably depends on the day and personality conflicts and what topics being asked. It's a great question. There isn't an easy answer. And so much of what we talk about in Common Sense is about mindset. And I think in general, if the CEO sees the board as an imposition, then it's unwelcome. On the other hand, if the CEO sees the board, particularly with these various perspectives and technical kind of areas of specific insight and expertise, if they see them as a resource and appreciate being held accountable and appreciate the collaborative effort to achieve results, then of course there's conflicts along the way. People are people and business is hard, but I think it's often appreciated. If you look at a more traditional, say a public board model, it's often built around hiring the CEO, ensuring there's a plan to meet the growth targets, maybe with an occasional acquisition discussion, and just kind of letting it run. And as you said, being differential to the CEO. On the private board side, it's often family members and golfing buddies. And everyone was there basically to manage their own interests or, be a source for professional referrals. Who do you recommend for, doing an audit, that kind of thing. Today, with these skills-based boards, it's much more about a committee, really, that supports each other with these balanced perspectives to ensure that the company is adequately accounting for long-term strategy and planning for disruption and understanding changing buyer behaviors and competition and global trends, while also acknowledging the importance of quarterly and annual trends. And that's a subject of a lot of discussion on boards. How do you balance short-term financial performance versus long-term goals? And there's a lot of people thinking and talking about that. If you start to unpack these topics, then it's interesting how many of them intersect with what we would call the traditional roles of marketing. How you track competitors, how you understand trends, how you observe changing buyer behaviors, what the product roadmap ought to be, what the revenue model could be, all those kinds of things. Marketing has a traditional role, whether it's product marketing and field marketing, and understanding them, and they're becoming critical to this strategic oversight the board's providing, and that really is putting this revenue growth function, I think, much more squarely in the sights of the board members.
So I guess in the past, there would have been a PowerPoint with forecast and projections, and we would have just sort of, watched that and then said, okay, great, and I guess things are different now. So in our book, Common Sense Revenue Growth, we talk a lot, just as you were just discussing, about the impact of changing buyer behaviors and how those things reflect on unreliable forecasts, extended sales cycles, stagnating quotes, and more deals that are left in the pipeline. So, on the one hand, a classic manager back in the day might be looking for some training, some sort of quick fix for some of these issues. but we're seeing more systemic trends that really require a higher level strategic approach. Does the board ever talk about things like that now?
Well, every board is different. And that's part of the importance of having these outside perspectives. If somebody's been within a company for their entire career, then if you see, quote, stagnating, you need sales training. That's just a natural reaction because that's the extent of your perspective. On the other hand, if you've come from outside, perhaps more so. I think in general, I would say that it's not broadly applicable across boards. Most are not yet taking that approach. And the problem is often that marketing and sales, when they get together in meetings, when they talk to senior management, they obsess about the software tools and the tactical steps that they're doing. And that doesn't add value to the strategic conversation. It doesn't push the dots close enough together that senior executives understand the value that marketing ought to be or could be bringing them. Those small issues aren't pertinent to the board. The board can certainly challenge the validity of projections, noting that they're consistently unreliable. But if you treat that as a finance question or a sales training issue and nobody pushes back and talks about, well, let's understand big changes in buyer trends. Let's understand buying journeys. Let's understand intent signals and the demand unit waterfall and all these other kinds of high-level things that are influencing the way companies with best practices are thinking about revenue growth. If you're not asking those questions, then the board's not doing its job. And if there's no rigorous program for target account management, and if CRM isn't properly used consistently so that you can identify where roadblocks are and make sure coaching is happening in the right ways, then the system breaks. And you end up essentially with this, with a board that is doing that kind of traditional rubber stamp without being the resource that it ought to be. On the other hand, if you have that unified growth perspective and that continuum that we've spoken about so often in the context of common sense revenue growth, where you've got people that are savvy around digital marketing and understand the tech stacks and know what's possible, particularly if they have experience in parallel industries that really are on I think, more advanced in revenue growth, then they can play a really important role on boards.
Yeah, I guess some of this depends on how good your senior executives are, right? I mean, how much of that discussion goes on in their meetings so that they get all this sort of straightened out, that they don't necessarily need that resource as much. And I guess that depends on what kind of company it is. If it's a family company where they've been doing things the same way for the last 40 years, that could be a problem, but maybe for a tech company that was a startup a few years ago and now is growing fast, not so much, because those guys really live and breathe tech and all these, these kind of approaches to new sales and so on. So what about that? What about the difference between different industries? Do they have much in common, or are they quite different?
So they are different, and I think your point about the quality of the management team is key. And of course, if the board's responsibility is to be the boss of the CEO, and part of what they're doing is holding the CEO accountable for talent management and developing the second tier of leaders and knowing who could step in to take the CEO's role and all that kind of stuff, then ultimately the board is responsible for that as well. Mm-hmm. But you raise a good point. In tech companies, the board is often digitally savvy. They may be financially naive, or at least the founders may be, but there are clearly representatives of investors on the board, as well as kind of the original tech masterminds. And as they grow, they may add some skills. I mean, they may add a member that's participated in taking a company public, for instance. And they may not have many independent directors because they've got investors and founders on the board, but they generally are, they're often one of the disruptors themselves. And so they're acutely aware of trends, and they're also accountable for rapid rates of growth, which means that they have to be understanding how to grow efficiently and how to be able to scale. And if you're really serious as investors about the board, the CEO is often protected a little bit because of their personal brand, their role in growing the business, and the particular unique technical expertise they brought originally that lets you create that company. But at the same time, the CEO serves at the will of the board. And I think that pressure for growth and the fact that they're in a community with others like them around means that there's people on those boards typically that just instinctively understand a lot of what's involved in growing. You compare that to kind of a traditional family-owned industrial manufacturing company. And the board is often family members, which, you understand if it's family owned, it's a family asset and they need to be represented on the board. And there's often a couple friends. And frequently they may know their business very well, but they're often naive about a variety of aspects of business. And confirmation bias is a huge problem. If they've got one person on the board that happens to be, a strong Facebook user and has a Twitter account and has worked with an email program, suddenly they may be the de facto expert on digital marketing, even though they've got a really, really, really small perspective on what's possible. Those boards also tend to focus on the manufacturing operations, and they're often profitable and in many cases debt-free, which means they're not under a lot of pressure to show performance and show growth. They may often not have any independent directors. And the board, in contrast to that investor-owned or led company where the CEO serves at the will of the board, in many cases here, the board serves at the will of the CEO, basically, with the exception of family members that are guaranteed a seat at the table. But the CEO can decide, I don't want to listen to it. I don't want to be held accountable. I want to be able to golf Wednesday afternoon. I want to let everyone take off Friday early. And you also often in those businesses have family members that hold these sinecures. They've been in roles in sales and marketing in the company for years. And if you start talking about challenging that and changing that, you talk about really uncomfortable. We just talked about Thanksgiving. Imagine Thanksgiving dinner for the extended family when you just told somebody, no, you're gone because your department shut down. I mean, that creates a dynamic that's really hard when you're talking about some of the substantial disruptions. Of course, public companies are a little bit different. I mean, obviously there's explicit requirements for independent directors. Investors often hold management accountable in ways that really gives the board a lot more air cover and authority and the expectation that they're going to perform their role in a much more sort of active way. So given these different situations, certainly you can see why the role of the board would be different. I think the question really comes down to who's the CEO's boss. Is it the board or is it the CEO? Because if the inertia of the status quo is really exaggerated by those family ties, then it's going to be really hard for a group to be engaged with the right skills and the vision to drive the business forward, because it's going to frustrate the effort.
Well, and I guess it's pretty common for the chairman of the board and the CEO to be the same person, right? So that's an explicit case of the CEO being his own boss,
right?
Or own boss. But do you still see that very often, or is that kind of unusual these days?
I think in many cases in these family-owned businesses, that remains the case. I think we've seen some very high-profile situations of public companies where they have intentionally bifurcated those roles. I mean, United about a year ago made a big deal of the fact, for instance, that they were splitting those up, and I think there's been a lot of discussion about the kind of the value of doing that.
Well, I guess what I'm hearing is that generally boards are more active nowadays and they provide more specific skills to help grow companies because they all have to, because business is changing, as you said. And then fast growth boards, especially in tech, tend to have the folks that know that space. They know the skills. They know how to do the fast growth strategies. And they're used to being more accountable for growth. Whereas in your more traditional conservative companies, like it's still pretty prevalent in the industrial space, it might be missing one or even both of those roles of the CEO. So right. I guess that's a generalization, but it sounds to me like there's an opportunity for industrial companies to learn from their tech cousins. Would you agree with that?
No, I completely agree. And I think that's a great point that you raise and a really important insight. We can't say for sure. And certainly manufacturing involves a lot of tech already. If you look at IoT and 3D printing in the cloud, et cetera. But I think in general, you're correct. And generalizations are unfair, but they're also reasonable in many cases because, the fact is you see it happening in a variety of places. I think that our discussion that we had several weeks ago on subscription revenue models is a great example where that's naturally evolved in the tech space. And companies in the industrial space are really resistant to it. It's a perfect example.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there actually might be some competition between industries that would help move some of these things along. Um, yeah, so in my experience, I've seen companies where both kinds of boards, and like you said, or we've been saying, that the tech company space is growing a lot faster, and they're kind of adapted the board more to that kind of growth curve. And that's very exciting. So I guess, the takeaways we'd have from this discussion would be that, what everyone should think about is building a board that really challenges the company in terms of expertise and breadth of scope. And then structuring that board to have a skills matrix. So it's not just a family of everybody kind of nodding their heads. And, that'll be much more important going forward with all the disruption and merging and, kind of dynamics of business that we have today. And then last but certainly not least, making revenue, an important part of that board, even a separate position that's completely accountable to the shareholders. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think elevating that revenue growth role to the point that, or putting those skills on the board is critical, so that the CEO is held to account for best practices. And your point, I think, is right on, that essentially you can make this a competitive differentiator for your business, whether you're looking to get acquired and want to add value to the enterprise that way, or just want to maximize your return on equity by doing the most with your company that you can. That takes a great board to bring those ideas. I think it's also an opportunity for an interesting follow-up on our last discussion. If age and gender and race and skills diversity are all key board topics, then for women with a real strategic vision and sales expertise and a deep understanding of digital marketing and buyer behaviors, there's an opportunity for them to obtain board roles that would not only benefit the companies, but help them advance their careers, and also speak to this systemic issue that we talked about last time of underrepresentation of overrepresentation of women in marketing, underrepresentation of women in marketing management, and the other topics that we talked through. So, but it's not enough to know blogging and SEO and paid ads. I mean, people really have to be able to conceptualize at a high level how to run a business, how growth happens. They need to be conversant and reasonably familiar with business accounting. They have to be a student of market trends. So it takes a lot of independent work for these people to prepare. And then, of course, there's hard work in finding a board position as well. For anyone that's listening that's interested, the NACD offers a lot of great material for prospective board members, as well as for companies that want to upgrade their boards. And they can find that, folks can find that at nacdonline.org.
That's great. Well, I've learned a lot today. I'd love to see more female board members, as you said, and I hope that does continue to happen. And I think, more of a blending between the way tech companies run themselves and the way traditional manufacturers run themselves could really be interesting, could show a lot more growth in that sector. So we'll see. And I think, for those of you watching, if you want to take your company to the next level and you're big enough to have a board, and I think, even small companies are starting to think that they at least need an advisory board and probably at some point a board of directors. We've got some resources for you. You can check out our book, Common Sense Revenue Growth. That's available on Amazon. And we frequently create these videos and podcast discussions. You can find those on riptidepress.com. And with that, we'll wrap up for today. I'm John.
And I'm Ed, and together we're Common Sense, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.